Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Mura Spring Dialogue, Looking Down, Reaching Out, the University in the 21st Century, Further Reflections. So I would suggest that everyone close their audio so that we can hear better the presentation. My name is Ginette Lamontagne. I'm president of the McGill University Retiree Association, MURA, and I will be your host for this event. McGill University is situated on the traditional territory of the Kenyan Kehaka, a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. We recognize and respect the Kenyan Kenyatta as the traditional custodians of the lands and waters on which we meet today. A special greeting to MURA members and to colleagues from across Canada who are joining us today. You are all most welcome. Thank you to the College and University Retiree Associations of Canada, CURAC, for announcing this event to their member associations. MURA featured this dialogue in the fall, and by popular demand, we are pleased to offer further reflections from our two speakers today. Henry and Susan Mintzberg, father and daughter, who will contrast two perspectives of the university in this century. I will introduce our speakers. First, Susan is a PhD candidate in the School of Social Work at McGill University. Her doctoral research explores the role of family caregivers in psychiatry with a focus on collaboration between family members and mental health care professionals. The work evolved from 10 years of clinical practice. Susan has always been drawn to interdisciplinary collaboration. Together with colleagues, she has taught and published work on mental health care, aging, and family systems. During this pandemic, Susan has been outspoken in the media with multiple opinion pieces and radio interviews regarding the essential role of family caregivers in healthcare and the importance of allowing designated family members into seniors' long-term care facilities. Henry Minsberg, is a writer and educator, mechanical engineering degree from McGill, worked at the CNR in operational research, got a PhD at the MIT Sloan School of Management, currently holds the Cleghorn Chair of Management Studies at the Desautels Faculty of Management at McGill. He co-founded and remains active in the International Master's Program for Managers and the International Masters for Health Leadership. Henry authored 20 books, including Managers, Not MBAs, Simply Managing, Rebalancing Society, and Managing the Myths of Healthcare. He also published 180 articles. Henry has a regular twog, which is a cross between a tweet and a blog that is provocative and fun. He also has several publications in the works. So, looking down from the Ivory Tower, faculty point of view, reaching out like an octopus, doctoral candidates point of view, Henry and Susan will speak for about 30 minutes, followed by a discussion, a Q&A discussion, that will be moderated by Kate McGuire, MURA's Vice President Internal, who also had the privilege of working with Henry for almost 10 years. So Susan and Henry, you've got the floor, please proceed.
All right, I'm gonna start by sharing my screen. Let's make sure this works. Good.
Okay. I'd also like, sorry to interrupt, Susie. At this point, I'm going to mute all the participants. And when it comes to the Q&A, you'll be able to turn yourself on if you want to speak with Henry or Susan.
Okay, may I just make sure Henry is unmuted. Or
right, I'm just going for that, yeah.
Okay. All right. It's funny, I can't see. I only see 5 people, so I can't see my father. So I hope you're there.
I'm here.
All right. Okay. So hello, everybody. So I'm Susie, and we're here with my father, Henry. So we've been working on this presentation. Well, actually, before I get that, let me introduce us. I'm going to back up for a minute. So the talk is Looking Down, Reaching Out, the University in the 21st Century. Oops, I got to figure out how to, hang on. Hold on. All right, there we go. All right, so this presentation came about because we had been talking kind of, my dad and I never really talked shop together before I started doing a doctorate. And as I began to get into, the work I was doing, I started to realize a little bit to my, or much to my surprise, that our ideas were quite similar. Our thinking was quite similar. The reason this surprised me is because we come from very different places academically or in our professions. So basically what we started to realize is that we were talking about these ideas that were very similar, which, I mean, you'll hear as we sort of talk through this. But what made it quite interesting is that we were bringing together two generations, two roles. So we have Henry, who is a seasoned professor, and myself, who's a doctoral candidate, hopefully not for very much longer. I'm hoping to graduate soon, and also coming from two different fields. So Henry, do you want to sort of talk? I know you like to sort of introduce this slide. Do you want to do it? Do you want me to?
This is the new Armstrong building, part of the Faculty of Management at McGill. It's glitzy and fancy and fine. And this is the entrance to the social work department, social work school, which is in a 5,000-year-old building. And the entrance has the scaffolding so that the things coming down from the roof won't fall on people's heads. But apparently they had to put up something to stop the scaffolding from coming down on people's heads. So this is just by way of a not too editorial comment about the difference between management and social work these days.
So I think, and I have a caveat to that. So the scaffolding's been there about 7 years or so. And because we've been slated to have renovations done that kept being delayed. And the good news is that in the middle of the pandemic is when they decided it was time to get going. So we needed to clear out the entire building a couple of months ago. So staff had to come in and clear out their offices. So the renovations are finally happening, and we've been moved out probably for several years before we go back in.
And how many days notice was that?
I don't know, a few weeks, I guess. I just thought it was very interesting that, we waited, and it was in the middle of a pandemic when no one could really go into buildings that it was time to sort of move out.
The scaffolding was there before the Armstrong building was built.
Yeah. So I think the point of this is really to say that we're really coming from two generations, two very different disciplines. But what's been very interesting is to realize, at least for me to realize, that I always assumed management and social work were as far apart as you could possibly get. And when I started to do my work, and my father and I started to talk shop a bit more. We started to realize how close these two fields were, and that's partly what this presentation grew out of. All right, so let's get to the actual talk. So the way, maybe I'll let you introduce how we first got going on this. So, yep.
Yeah. So I was invited by UQuat, Université de Québec, Abitibi-Témiscamingue, to talk for a 40th anniversary. I think it was 40th anniversary of something, and so I thought it'd be nice to go with the whole family up there because I hadn't been that far north in Quebec, or at least that way. And I proposed that we do this together, and we did that in French. So we used a famous old Quebec expression, shaker la cabane, which I'm sure Anglophones can figure out. And that's how it got started. Susie, by the way, is the master of PowerPoints and discovers all these wonderful photographs and everything.
I normally just advance this quickly, but I'm going to give a heads up because we often miss it. So this was my little special touch. Pay attention to the screen. Oh. It usually goes very quick when you don't catch it. So, I mean, basically when we went to, this was the first time we'd ever worked together when we did this presentation. And what was really interesting is we realized we were really, and we were asking similar questions and had very common concerns. So it was very interesting to sort of bring it together, and we started evolving these ideas about academia and questions, and not so much concerns, but more like questions and things that we saw in academia that I don't know, troubled us or made us question things. So that's how this began. And then as we sort of kept working on it, things have evolved. So, and which has reached the presentation that we're at now. So after lots of speaking and going over all these ideas, what we finally came up with was this. Okay, so it's this idea that there is the more traditional model of academia, which we called the Ivory Tower model, and it's this idea that traditionally in the Ivory Tower, you've got academics who are kind of up in their tower and they're kind of, looking down at what's going on below, but aren't that involved in what's going on the ground traditionally. And I think to a large extent, things are shifting, but I think to a large extent, this still unfortunately happens a little bit too much. So my father's going to get into more details, but right now I just want to give you the two models. So we started thinking about like, how do we shake this up? Like things we need to sort of modernize. Academia tends to be an institution, as probably we all know, that change is very slow. Things happen very gradually. And there's a sense sometimes that it's just disconnected from reality today. So we started rethinking of this and came up with another model that we called the octopus model. And the idea with this is that it's a model where it's more about reaching out and people working together and being in touch with communities. So each, all of the tentacles could represent, for example, different departments, but that all these arms are working together. So rather than sort of everyone being alone in their little tower, it's this idea that we have all these arms that are working in unison. So to get into a bit more detail, I'm going to pass the baton over, and here are some of the things that we're going to be looking at.
So there's just contrasting words. Sort of one is perched, one is grounded, one is objective, supposedly, ostensibly. The other is connected. One is rigorous. The other is about relevance. One is about evidence. The other is more about experience. We'll talk later about how these are overly sharp distinctions, but we think they work just to contrast, and then we come to reality a bit later. So next one.
So we've divided this, to explain this in a little bit more detail, we've divided this into sort of 4 headings. All right, so we're going to go through all 4 of them. The first one is researching. So I'm going to let you kind of explain what these images are, and then I'll sort of pick up from there.
Some of you may recognize the people in these pictures. To the right is Watson and Crick, who came up with the DNA, the double helix kind of description. And to the left is Rosalind Franklin, who would have probably won the Nobel Prize with them, except she passed away and they don't give it to people who are deceased. But she was the proper traditional researcher in a way, who made their discovery possible, but didn't make it. If we look at sort of the relationship between art, craft, and science, it really works very well, because Franklin was science in a way, traditional, empirical research. Watson was art. He's the guy on the left, sort of crazy creative. And Crick was very much craft. Crick, as it shows, Crick was busy building wooden models all the time. And when they did get there, there's a line in Watson's book that says that it was too beautiful not to be true. Franklin, on the other hand, at least in the film, I'm not sure I read her account ever, but in the film said it was staring me, something to the effect that it was staring me in the face and I just didn't see it. This shows the kind of 2 sides. It also indicates the necessity of collaborating across those 2 sides, but too often it's a divide. So that's researching.
Okay, no, I'll just pick up a bit. Oops, sorry, I'm going to go back for a second. So just to sort of bring this in from kind of a perspective, kind of someone coming into academia, so from a doctoral student perspective, one of the things that really struck me throughout my work is that, I mean, as much as academia has evolved, and I think there's space for kind of new kinds of research, it's really kind of quite astonishing about how academia is still so focused around, you know, a more traditional form of research. So I tend to do much more qualitative research, and I've dabbled in arts-based research and really looked at kind of more alternative ways of doing research, which a lot of people are doing, but it tends to still be, especially arts-based and the more kind of creative approaches, tend to be considered, I don't know if this is the right word, but kind of on the fringes a little bit. And so what's really interesting is to see how this, even though things have evolved and people are doing all kinds of new types of research and using all kinds of new methodologies, there's still really this sense that, you know, the coveted research or the one that's going to get the funding often is the more traditional or the more quantitative type of research. And that's been something that, you know, I've had lots of discussions with lots of people, and it really, I mean, as we go through these other categories, we'll discuss it, but it really impacts not just your research, but it has impact on how you move forward in your career. So the next.
Wait, hang in there for a sec, Susie. I'm just gonna make a comment. I think if we're looking for evidence of that tilt in academia, I think the pandemic is a wonderful example of it, in the sense that many of the scientists have their paradigm, their kind of worldview, their way of seeing things. And it's been very difficult, particularly in terms of what I've been trying to do, it's been very difficult to convey any other message that falls between the cracks of the established sciences. You just don't throw new ideas in the air. They get dismissed as equivalent to Trump's idea of bleach. One other comment about quantitative and qualitative. My research is called qualitative. There's a strong bias in the main journals in management towards so-called quantitative. My research has been called qualitative. If you look at probably my single most successful article and my most successful book, they're loaded with numbers. They're absolutely loaded with numbers. So those are complete misnomers. By qualitative, we really mean inductive, and by quantitative, we really mean deductive. And you can be inductive or deductive with or without numbers. So the whole vocabulary is all screwed up in a certain way.
Okay. So that then impacts on this next topic, which is disseminating. So when you pick these two slides, I should just put a nod. My doctoral supervisor, who's actually attending today, I invited her at the last minute. So these are two publications that she did, and it's really the point of this is to really show what's on the left is kind of what we're expected to produce, and this is what we're judged on, and this is how our career is going to evolve. It's kind of what we've published on the left, meaning publishing in journals, and not just journals but gold star journals or A journals. And then what's on the right is more kind of what I would consider kind of publishing in the media. So getting the same message across, but to I would say a broader audience, and kind of really reaching the masses. And one of the things that I, again, speaking from where I'm coming from, as I'm kind of making my way through this doctorate, that's really kind of troubled me going through is just how academia is still, I would say, I want to say 100%, but I'll be fair and say 95% geared around where we disseminate and how we disseminate. So there's lots and lots of researchers doing all kinds of creative work that's being disseminated in all kinds of original ways, or through the media, or through plays, or through music even. But at the end of the day, when you go to apply for jobs, for funding, for anything that's going to try and move your career forward, mostly what people are interested in is, what journals have you published in? What was the I always forget the H factor, so it's really about not only what journals, but how popular are these journals, and that's going to really have an impact on everything moving forward. And what I find really unfortunate is it just doesn't leave enough room for this other type of dissemination. number one, and number two, especially someone my original career was in photojournalism. So as someone who really believes that we can reach, people in all kinds of important ways through the media, unfortunately, that often doesn't count for much when it comes to moving forward in academia.
There are a few researchers like Tamara who can do both comfortably. But it's really what we need in a sense. You can almost define a so-called A journal or what's it, Star Journal? I forget the other term that's being used.
Gold Star.
A Gold Star as talking to each other and leaving everybody else out. In fact, when I read the titles of most proper management articles, first of all, they're incomprehensible. And second of all, I'm tempted to say, why did they bother with an abstract? Abstract should say see title, because the abstracts are so long and the titles are so long and convoluted. And it's a giveaway, I think, for talking to each other and excluding anybody who might use that research.
And I think also if we look at the pandemic, one of the things that I think has really sort of come out is, the importance of getting the work that researchers are doing or academics are doing and making it accessible to the public. I think we're moving more and more where people want that. They want to understand. And so I think reaching the masses is critical, and we're not doing that through journals. And yet, I'm not going to move ahead in my career unless I've, got so many publications in journals that basically other academics are going to be reading. All right. So next is educating. Do you want to sort of talk to this slide, especially the one on the right, and then I can talk a bit about my experience with it, or do you want me to?
Yeah. The French word for lecturing is magistral. It's a perfect word, and that photograph really captures it. He's not quite looking down, but in effect, he's looking down because he's looking out to the masses. Whereas the picture on the right was taken in our International Masters for Health Leadership program. You can see a couple of things evident in that picture. First of all, the people are not 22-year-olds pretending they're learning how to manage. They're 45-year-olds on average who have enormous experience in healthcare. Second of all, they're sitting at a round table. Half the time in our program is devoted to the people learning from each other, reflecting on the experience and learning from it. So it's a perfect meeting of looking down and reaching out. Half the time we kind of lecture or drop in our pearls of wisdom, but the other half is how they can run with it and what they can do with it. There's something else that's interesting that some of you may realize in that picture. The woman in the green or brown is Leslie Breitner, who runs the program, and she happened to be sitting at one of the tables. You'll never see that guy in white sitting in the lecture hall listening to somebody else's lecture, or rare. I would say that in my, decades of regular teaching, I closed the door and nobody ever came into that room. No dean, no professor ever came into that room. In our other program on the right side, there's rarely less than 3 faculty in the room, and sometimes there are 4 or 5 because they're curious, they're sitting in, they're part of the team, they're involved, however it is. So it's a whole different philosophy. You can look these up. IMPM.org is the business program, and IMHL.org is the healthcare program.
So the thing that when it came to educating that really struck me is you go through a doctoral program, and I'd say the majority of people doing a doctorate are hoping to go into academia, and if they do end up in academia, they will absolutely be teaching. And yet in most programs, and at one point I had sort of looked across Canada, but in most programs, not only are there no required courses in teaching, but there's not even any elective courses. So what always amazed me is, we're training all these people who are going to spend a good chunk of their careers teaching, but we don't even give them a single course on teaching, like on how to teach, which to me is just unbelievable. And I often sort of use the comparison that I say, if I imagine that you're going to have a meet the teacher night with your child's grade 4 teacher, and when you sit down to meet them, you find out that they never did a single teaching course in their life. I don't think anyone would be very pleased to know that their kids are being taught by someone who never learned how to teach. And yet here we are in higher education, pumping out all these students who are going to go out there and spend a good chunk of their careers teaching and never teach them any skills on how to teach. And to me, that's just very disappointing, as someone who enjoys teaching too. And again, it sort of taps into what we were saying earlier about this sort of, what counts in academia. And it's so much so that if you in our program, often doctoral students do get a chance to teach before they graduate, but there's sort of this sense that if you've taught one course, then that's enough. Put it aside, because now you got to focus on publishing, because your teaching portfolio is going to be okay. So it's really, again, it falls into that same category that even if you do get the opportunity to teach, there's sort of this message that, go ahead and do it, but don't get too involved, because right now what you need to be doing is publishing. And again, if you're not going to be taught to teach, the next best thing is to actually learn to do it in a classroom while you're, training to get your doctorate. So,
when we introduced our doctoral program, which is a joint program across the 4 Montreal universities, I proposed that we have one course in pedagogy. And I got pushback like whoever heard of a course in pedagogy? And I said, devoting 3% of the program to what we end up doing 40% of our career, and 97% of the program to the other 40%, which is research, the other 20% being administration, is not excessive. So to this day, we have one, with the exception that makes the rule, we have one course in pedagogy in the management doctoral program.
And I just add one thing, McGill has some really interesting programs to train to teach. You have to go look for them. So I found one that was came out of chemistry originally, which is a fantastic program. But no one's telling you about this. You have to go find it. I happened to stumble on it, or it was a colleague of mine who told me about it. So there are things out there, and people who really love teaching and are dedicated to teaching, but no one's really guiding us towards that. So to me, that's in our modern day, if we were to sort of think of academia in the 21st century, to me, this is absolutely something that I think we need to be focusing on. We need better teachers in academia. All right, the next one I pass to you, because this is out of my league.
This is so these are 2 books that I did related to strategy, or a book and an article. And the one on the left is a book called The Rise and Fall of Strategic Planning. Strategic planning is if there's any technique in management that's looking down, it's strategic planning. It's as if some planners and some senior executives get together and lay out the strategy, and everybody else implements. It's very much a looking down, top down, leadership driven, and so on. Some years ago, I did a study of strategy at McGill, and defining strategy not as plan, but as pattern in action. In other words, defining strategy not as what McGill intended to do, which doesn't matter much. It's what McGill actually did do. So we looked at patterns in actions at McGill. For example, when new faculties were introduced, when certain expansion plans took place, different things. When McGill got rid of faculties, it only did once in its entire history, which was veterinary medicine. It only lasted about 10 years. Talk about changelessness. And the administrative model, the traditional administrative model, not only in universities, although it applies less well in universities than in business, and it's also often applies badly in business, is there's a top and a bottom. People talk about top management. Nobody ever dares to say bottom management, but if there's a top, there must be a bottom. And the top sort of pronounces or deems, and everybody else follows, which is not the way really great companies work at all. And just to give you a simple example of strategy, the reaching out form of strategy, which I call emergent strategy, which is strategies emerge as you solve problems. We learn strategies on the right. We plan strategies on the left. We all know the IKEA strategy, which is brilliant and simple, that you can buy much of the furniture unassembled. So that you save money, they save money, and you can get it in your car and get it home, and so on and so forth. A brilliant, absolutely brilliant strategy. Changed the furniture business dramatically. This didn't come out of a strategic planning exercise. It didn't come out of an executive meeting. It came from a worker who tried to put a table in his car and it didn't fit. So he took the legs off. And then came the critical strategic moment, which was down there by that car. If we have to take the legs off, so do our customers. That's how a lot of the great strategies come about. What's the strategy of McGill University? The strategy of McGill University is the sum total of the programs that it does. I once asked a vice principal academic what he was spending his time on, and he's talking about salary policy. The key part of strategy, which you could call in business terms a product market position, who are you serving with what kinds of offerings, doesn't come from the administration. The IMPM and the IMHL did not come from principals or even deans. They came from me and colleagues who came up with this. Some great lung facility at one of the Montreal hospitals didn't come from a hospital administrator. It came from a pulmonologist who wanted to champion that kind of activity. So the university is actually the sum total. The university's strategy is actually the sum total of all the initiatives. So strategy is not about planning in the university, it's about venturing. It's about people trying things and working them through. And we had to go through 11 committees to get the IMPM approved. That was before the healthcare one. Then the healthcare one kind of followed more easily. But we had to go through 11 committees, including Senate, including the Board of Governors, and including the Quebec University Committee. So we had to play the game on the left, but we were doing it in terms of the right. It was, and ever since, that particular program has been a center of creative innovation in pedagogy. And that's because we're in the class and we're solving problems all the time. And the participants, we don't call them students because they're participants, are also solving problems all the time in the classroom. So we're constantly innovating. That's where strategy comes from, especially in a university. If you have a Steve Jobs in a big company, of course, the chief executive is a major player, but Jobs was on the ground. Jobs was working in his mornings in the lab, developing product. That's what he was doing. He wasn't reading financial statements. He was developing product himself. You go find me a book that says the chief executives of big companies should be developing product. But that's what made Apple so famous. So there's a big difference between the sort of classic view of strategic planning and all that nonsense, and I think it is nonsense. Strategic planning is an oxymoron. You don't plan a strategy. And what really goes on with the venturing that happens in universities. I could say some other things, but I think basically about that, that's probably enough.
Okay, so once we sort of got these ideas going, one of the things that struck us is that here we were kind of talking about, moving, or not moving away, but kind of creating a new model from the Ivory Tower model. And we spent all this time and we came up with this new model. So we started with this idea that, we've got this new octopus model, and the idea that it's more open, it's more connected, it's spread out, it spreads out rather than kind of, looks down or grows up, if you want. And hold on. So it's open and connected, but it's away from both extremes. So it's not going, from one extreme to the other. But then we started kind of realizing, ultimately what we're doing is, if we're saying, we've got this one model and here we're sort of proposing another model, we're actually kind of falling ourselves into this Ivory Tower kind of model in a way, by basically saying, we've got a new model and this, my model is better than your model, which is, to me, typical of classical, academia. I have the right answers, and the classic to me is, going to a PhD student's defense, and then someone on the committee ends up going on for 20 minutes to try and spew off, whatever they know to kind of show that they know better, even though really that's not what a doctoral defense is about. But, academia is full of people trying to outdo each other with, who knows more or who knows better. So it occurred to us, like, this isn't about, my model is better than your model, or that, the octopus model should replace, the Ivory Tower model. It's really about bringing these two models together, because it's not to sort of throw one out. The traditional model is important. We need research that's happening that way, but we also need to be getting with the times and making space for people who are doing things differently, or want to do things differently, or think about things differently. And so again, I go back to, what I know, and, those incredible arts-based researchers who are out there shouldn't be struggling to get their stuff published any more than the scientists are trying to, get their stuff published.
Back to the Watson, Crick, Franklin, it was Watson and Crick who came up with it, but they couldn't have done it without Franklin. So it's that collaboration that's really important. And there was a lot of conflict between the two teams. In fact, in the end, Franklin's boss ended up sharing the Nobel Prize with the other two. But there was a lot of conflict. But the impression you get about Crick and Watson is they were playful. They were having a good time.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's really, again, I think it's really about, as we move forward and we sort of think about, the university in the 21st century, I think ultimately it's about kind of being more open and being more willing to sort of take on things that might be different or might traditionally not have been as acceptable. Do you want to take this one?
Yeah, better. So when I was doing my book on structure, called The Structuring of Organizations, I developed this chart on the left, the little one on the upper left, which was a kind of showing different parts of the organization. And what I didn't realize until much later when I started to revise the book is that it is hierarchical, and it does look like the traditional kind of hierarchy. So I was kind of part of that, even though I was talking about emergent strategy at the base and all kinds of other things. While I was doing this, Susie was about 6, and I was working in the basement. And one day she does this little drawing. She must have been looking over my shoulder, seeing all these diagrams I was doing on the left. And she did this diagram, which couldn't have been random. It had to be influenced by what she saw. It's too close. And sort of my, I'm not an art interpreter, but my interpretation of this is that, number one, she shows structures within structures within structures. Number two, she's lopped the head. Even back then at 6, she lopped the head off all these organizations, enough of this top management. And by so doing, she released this kind of phoenix-like bird that's the kind of creative end of things. So kind of amusing how we started this talk like 45 years ago, whatever it was.
I think sort of one of the main themes that's kind of we like to bring up and that's important to us is this whole idea of collaboration, right? I mean, that's the sort of idea of this octopus model where we've got these arms that are working together. So when we happened to come across this, and I thought this has been a long-term collaboration that's been going on. So sort of to wrap things up. So we want to kind of finish by bringing it into the present and, what's going on, right now this year. And one of the things that's been very interesting to observe is what academia was pre-pandemic and what it managed to do during the pandemic. So what's very striking is that, in that story Henry told about, trying to get that IMHL going in 11 committees, is that academia moves very, very, very slowly. So anytime you want to make any change or get anything through, it's long term. I mean, even the way we publish, right? I mean, if, I've been doing quite a bit of publishing, doing opinion pieces, and you write an opinion piece, you write it one day and 2 days later it's in the newspaper and people are reading it. You write a journal article, it's going to go through I don't know how many revisions, it's going to sit on someone's desk. I mean, it can take a year or more to get these things published sometimes. So everything
11 committees for the IMPM. Yeah.
Okay, so that's kind of, traditionally, I think, how academia works. We can't do anything fast. There's lots of administration. There's lots of bureaucracy. Along comes a pandemic. And suddenly, if we take McGill as an example, McGill that didn't have online education, and as far as I understand, wasn't really in support of online education, within 2 months of the pandemic hitting, the entire of McGill had gone online. And I always sort of think, if someone 2 years ago had said, you know what, I'm giving you a couple of months to turn this whole university into an online, program. I mean, it would have been, you just would have been laughed at, and yet we did it. So I think that, the point is that we come up with all these excuses about why we can't make change, why things are the way they are, why things have to remain that way. And ultimately, it's a lot of nonsense, because if we want to do it, and if we decide that we're going to do it, then we are very capable of making it happen. And one of the things that just recently we were talking about it, now that vaccines are out and people are starting to be vaccinated, obviously the whole idea of how quickly these vaccines came to be is quite incredible, given normally how long, from what I understood, a vaccine usually takes about 10 years from start to finish. And here we managed to get it done in less than a year. And I had heard a specialist talking about it who was explaining, to try and reassure people who were worried about, I don't want a vaccine that only took a year to be made. And he was explaining that, part of what allowed these vaccines to happen so quickly was that all the bureaucracy kind of got knocked out. So first of all, we didn't have to jump through hoops and go through 6,000 committees. We didn't have to convince funding boards. We didn't have to sort of pitch our product and then be thrown away and then go back 6 months later, et cetera, et cetera. That was number one. And the other thing that I found very interesting when we talk about collaboration is that we had all these people, internationally ultimately, but people who might have, in normal times been working against each other, or not against, but each working in their own silos or in their own towers, were now coming together to do this collaboratively. And I think the pandemic's been an incredible example of what we can do if we decide we want to do it, number one. And number two, it's been a fantastic example of what can happen when we work together. And so I think, for me, my closing sort of ideas are, as we move forward, we really need to be thinking, about academia, about more collaborative, about working together, and about kind of just being more open to what can be and leaving space for that to happen. I'll let you kind of, if you have anything.
And then there's the WHO, which took the longest time to even recognize asymptomatic transmission, and only grudgingly recognized aerosol transmission, and it hasn't much changed what people are saying. They're still saying, don't bother wearing a mask if you can keep your distance. Well, the aerosols don't necessarily respect those 6 feet guidelines. So it's still, you still have so much that's gone on. This pandemic has also been restricted by so many conventional, hierarchical, paradigmic, I guess you could say, but paradigms by all kinds of scientists who nobody's looking into the issues of this pandemic that fall between the cracks of different specialties. There's so many anomalies associated with this pandemic. Why do outbreaks happen in certain places and not others? And the obvious answers don't apply that easily. Why the second wave worse than the first wave? Why the variants rising around the same time in such different parts of the world? Goes on and on and on. Who's addressing that? Who's doing the playful, sort of right-sided, reaching out kinds of investigation? I'm speaking from sheer frustration about trying to make a point about pollution and the role it's playing in this pandemic, and the impossibility of even getting anyone to entertain that hypothesis. So on one hand, the universities have been remarkable at switching. On the other hand, the medical and the healthcare establishment, certainly the people who develop vaccines have been amazing, but a lot of it has been very, very traditional.
Which I think comes back to this idea that, things happen not just in academia, it's, across the board, and there's research organizations, et cetera. But to me, it speaks to that idea that we need to start being much more open to other ways of thinking. And so that sort of comes back to what we've been saying. It's, the world to a large extent, especially the scientific world, very much sticks to that traditional model. So anyone doing anything that's sort of out of the box or different, or whatever you want to call it, creative, or just thinking differently or looking at anomalies, often gets pushed to the back of the line. And we're missing out on some really interesting and important work because of that, I think.
Yep.
All right. So we will continue this. And I mean, obviously, like these are our ideas, and part of them have grown out of discussions we've had with people. So we love questions and we love discussion, and hopefully we'll hear a bunch from people who are attending, because that's sort of what it's all about, really.
Okay.
All right, I will unshare my screen so that we can sort of get back to seeing the whole group.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Susie and Henry. And Kate, you will take over as the moderator of the discussion period.
Kate must be muted.
Sorry about that. It will be my pleasure to moderate the Q&A part of this presentation. If you have any questions for Henry or Susie, please use the chat feature.
Or just comments.
Yeah, or
We
raise,
could, okay.
raise your hand.
No, you can unmute yourself and ask the question if you want to get another discussion going here. You'd have to unmute yourself in order to be heard.
I have a question. Henry, you mentioned a lot of important questions that haven't been looked at. And as you were listing some of the kinds of questions, it struck me that each one needed a different type of person with different expertise. That it's not a list of questions that one academic type could answer. Yeah. And in order to do a lot of that work, you need money. And I'm not sure that the granting agencies, let alone pharma, would offer that money to look into some of those things. What do you think?
Well, I think that's definitely part of the problem. But not everything needs money. People can brainstorm about things too, and pursue things. One of my favorite stories is about Dr. Snow, who thought that cholera in the mid-19th century was transmitted through water, and everybody knew it was transmitted through air, until he started to pinpoint where people were dying, and he basically demonstrated. All he had was a map and a bunch of pins, and he'd visiting a lot of places. So, I think a lot of research is detective work, especially about cause. Trying to find cause, some of it requires some very fancy molecular theory, but a lot of it just requires detective work. The thing I've been doing on pollution simply requires the atmospheric scientists to get in touch, with or people who study pollution to get in touch with some of the healthcare people. But, to my mind, that has not happened. I've been in touch with people on both sides of that. But it doesn't happen. I think the granting agencies are a problem. I think money is part of a problem, for sure.
Okay, Walter Archer has his hand raised. You have a question?
I don't really have a question. I just wanted to point out I put a bunch of comments into the chat feature. And possibly the comment that I'd like to make is, as a higher education specialist, I'd like to remind us that university community engagement has been going on for about 2 centuries, going back to at least the founding of the land grant institutions back in the United States in the mid-19th century, which were funded specifically to address practical problems, specifically agriculture and engineering. And it is always carried on since then, and now there are major organizations putting on international conferences on community university engagement. And I pointed out where you can find a link to 5 major journals on community university engagement.
Yeah, it's interesting. A good point. I kind of restricted the comments I made about administration to internal within the university and how they tend to function. I think McGill, by the way, is very good at engagement and people feeling part of it, and faculty very much involved in the administration, in and out, and so on and so forth. Some universities just don't do that. And there's a very strong top-down kind of attitude in some other universities.
I mean, I would add also, I think, I mean, again, this is sort of where we're sort of talking about, it's not one versus the other, what's better or worse. So, I mean, I'm coming from social work, and for sure in social work, there's lots and lots of community engagement. It's part of what our career is about. It's what our field is about. But I think to me, so for sure this is happening. And I've been involved in stuff that's happening. I think to me, the part that I find troubling is that in the world of academia, people are doing it, but it's not counting for moving ahead. So when I kind of, apply as a newbie, let's say, when I apply, I've done tons of writing that connects to community. It's what I believe in. My background is journalism. I worked in the field for years. But if I apply for a job or if I apply for funding, that stuff is really not going to count for all that much. I mean, I think in certain universities or certain colleges for sure, but generally that's not going to count. In fact, when I apply for different funding bodies or through different funding bodies, often in the application, there's not even anywhere to put that work. Like I can't even, I just, because of who I am, when it asked for peer review stuff and I had other stuff that wasn't, I'm like, too bad, I'm putting it in, do what you want with it. But that's sort of part, I think that to me is really the issue. It's not necessarily that it's not happening, it's that it's really limited what we count it for.
Yeah, I think you better add, Susie, that you've done a number of academic journal articles too. It's not like one or the other.
Yeah, no, I don't think that's, again, it's not one or the other. And I think academic journals and articles certainly have their place and are important. It's just that it's all the weight is put on that. And that's the part that I sort of am troubled by.
Yeah.
I believe I'll alternate between people using the hands up icon and people who are writing their questions in the comments. So I'll take from the comments next. Marilyn Callahan is asking, how do you think the pandemic will change teaching and learning in the academy?
We'll see. I think it has. I mean, I think it already has to a certain extent, simply because I don't know if kind of Zoom learning and teaching is necessarily the best way to do it, but people who have been doing it have certainly had to rethink and adapt. So maybe my answer would be that maybe what the pandemic has done has taught us that we can learn to do it differently. Once the pandemic's over and we're mostly not teaching on Zoom anymore, possibly, will we take some of those lessons we learned and maybe kind of apply it to being back in the classroom? What can we do differently?
I get asked that question a lot about management too. How will management change after the pandemic? And one of my, I did a blog, if you look at minsberg.org/blog, called Zooming Ahead, Not So Fast, because Zoom calls are amazing. I mean, look at this. Look at what's sitting in front of us. Phenomenal. We walk up to my laptop and here we are. And we could never do that even in person as effectively. But we've got to be careful. And I think it's the same thing with teaching. It will open up fantastic vistas, but we can't also think that there's no need for people to get together in classrooms. We've had open universities in England, for example, for a long time, and the tutoring model of Oxbridge is also very important. That face-to-face interaction in small groups is critically important.
Auntie Pageant, you have a question?
Well, I have first of all, thank you, Henry, and daughter and daughter team for steering up a few things. In fact, you have started with quite a few comments that would be possible to elaborate. One that I think is on our mind, thinking about what is university doing, how do we do research, how do we fund, how do we actually teach kids thinking? And one thing that I see always, and I have tried some projects that would connect humanities and hard science to try to see if there is any common ground where one would learn from the other. Typically, scientists have never seen themselves in the mirror. There is no culture of self-reflection. It is one of going on as a by rote, apply grant thing and try to find somebody who is going to fight for you in the committee. Problems have accumulated to the extent that science is now a business. In fact, we had a discussion about certain hiring and in medicine, and one of the qualities of the candidate was that this guy thinks really like a real businessman in medicine. And I didn't quite understand why would that be advantage when we have something to deal with human nature or human people or whatever. If you remember 2014, there was an article by 4 members of National Academy who addressed the question, where is science in the United States going? And they have given a very gloomy picture and defined few major points. One of them was hyper competitiveness, in which clearly the system stimulates things that are not called good behavior, not certainly good thinking. That results in what? Enormous production of completely irrelevant products of thinking. I mean, how many papers got referred to from millions of those that are published?
Can I just interrupt because
Sure. I could go for longer than this, so I'm sorry.
Yeah, I
have
want
a few more comments.
Yeah, no, I want to comment on a couple of things you said because they're of interest to me in a special way. The university is a business and the absence of reflection. And I agree with both, but I agree with both absolutely across the board in society, everywhere, everything's a business. It's not just universities, it's everything. I teach, we call it a management school, but it's kind of a business school. And I am totally opposed to that point of view. I think it's incredibly destructive. Healthcare, for example, is a calling. It's not a business, it's a calling. And if we treat it as a business, we're destroying it. And reflection, you know, the question that plagues me today is what is dumbing down so many people? And I wonder if it's just distraction with too much of the media or whatever it is, but it's a huge problem. So yeah, good.
And I'd actually add to that because, you know, coming from social work, like our students can't even hear the word self-reflection because we do so much of it and it's so much part of our training. But one of the things my supervisor and I are working on, what's very interesting is as much as in social work, there's so much reflexivity and self-reflection when it comes to kind of academic PhD or academic social work or you know, doing research in it, somehow that reflexivity is no longer tolerated in the same way. I mean, again, I'm making an overall statement, and there's lots of people who are in social work or in other fields who are doing research that does have that reflexivity to it. But what's quite striking is how little room there is for kind of ourselves and our thinking and our feelings in research, even in a field like social work, where we are so centered on kind of being in touch with what we're, you know, what is our role in our work.
Don't you think that this is the result of a tendency that you have to be absolute master in a small part of the total? And the system allows you to know everything about nothing.
I think
this is a joke, but it is a big burden.
I think it's that, but I also think it's coming to a large extent from kind of more traditional research where emotions aren't tolerated. And as human beings, emotions, often we're not comfortable with it, right? If you go to an academic conference and someone stands up there and shows any kind of emotion, people will often get uncomfortable. And yet, emotions are what often touch people the most and what gets them thinking the most. So it's sort of this interesting divide.
An expert is somebody who knows more and more about less and less until finally he or she knows everything about nothing. A manager is someone who knows less and less about more and more until finally he or she knows something about nothing about everything.
Well, there is an interesting discussion between traditional specialties in genetics and the need for systemic approach to these studies. You remember the selfish gene, and everything comes from the gene, and big fights about, is this really so?
Yeah.
And there was a discussion between
we
If
should,
Auntie, we have,
we should let some other people.
sorry,
Yeah,
I'm
we have-
talking too
yes,
much.
yes,
We'll meet
Jenny-
some other
questions,
time,
Auntie.
Henry.
yes,
Sorry, sorry, sorry.
Jenny Hornasti has been very patient.
Oh, sorry.
And she's saying, it seems to a large extent, administrators hire consultants to develop strategic plans. How does one get them off that track?
Well,
I know you'd like that one, Henry.
the reason they do that is because they're supposed to have strategic plans. If the donors have the power or the government has the power, they say, where are your strategic plans? So they play this game of creating these documents that nobody ever looks at again and hire consultants to do it because they don't know what the heck to do. And everybody's wasting everybody's time. You don't make strategy the way you bring on Jesus Christ, with Immaculate Conception. You make strategy by solving problems and learning on the ground. You make strategy by taking legs off tables. That's how you make strategy. This is a stupid game that everybody wastes their time with.
I agree with you 100%. And it's been some years since I've been retired, but they're still doing that. And not only are they hiring these people who know nothing, but they're also spending a lot of money. I mean, I love your comment, strategic planning is an oxymoron. I mean, it's, to me, part of it, it's the breakdown of collegiality within universities.
Absolutely. It's a top down, we know better, and we're putting it all together, and it's all, there's no sense of constructing a strategy out of pieces, putting it all together. And it's not necessarily not senior management. As I say, Steve Jobs was a brilliant strategist, but he was on the ground. That's why he was a brilliant strategist.
So how do we change it? That's kind of your question, right?
How does one change that? I mean, how do you people change it? Said I've retired. We tried to change that when I was there, and didn't work.
Just by challenging them. Give them my book. I don't know. I mean, no. I mean, it's just once you challenge them, they have no recourse. They have no argument to say, well, I can prove that strategic planning works. They have no recourse. It fails. There's a famous comment by Wildowski, a famous professor of political science. He was referring to PPBS, Planning, Programming, Budgeting system, which is a government equivalent. And he said it fails everywhere. And it was front and center in Vietnam with McNamara. And he said it failed everywhere all the time.
Well, thank you so much to both you. Excellent, excellent comments made.
Noel Schul from Memorial University has a question.
Yes, thanks. I only have extensive knowledge of one university. That's the one I've been at for a number of years. It seems to me that both models exist within the university, and both models are quite strong, but they are specialties within the university. So, for example, the president's office is very much involved with reaching out. The individual academic departments are quite concerned with not necessarily looking down, but certainly looking into things in great depth. The one set of areas in the university that seems to me tries to do both with more or less emphasis on one or the other would be the professional schools, because their clientele are in the community, and they cannot succeed particularly well unless they're constantly in conversation with the profession. So I don't think it's a case of coming up with a new approach or strategy. It's a question of how to get a focus, for example, on academics among
He's frozen.
concentration on community in especially the specifically academic departments, and perhaps the professional schools can kind of be a model in some ways for what might be done using both models.
Yeah, let me tell you a funny story about Susie. I think it's a wonderful story. I wrote a book about that there was about healthcare, managing the myths of healthcare, which was very critical of this top management coming down so heavy on the physicians, you know, with measures and all kinds of rules, and you know, or governments doing it or insurance companies doing it. And Susie shot back with an email and said, you could take the word top management and physicians and replace top management with physicians and physicians with social workers, and you'd have exactly the same thing. But these detached psychiatrists are busy pushing the social workers around, and the social workers know what's going on with the patients often a lot more than the psychiatrists do. So it's kind of interesting how these things kind of repeat.
Okay, actually, I have a question from Ronald Krellinston. Dumbing down is related to the lack of critical thinking, and that's why the humanities, philosophy, history, theater, art should be integrated into all programs. Comments?
I agree.
Yeah, I was going to say I agree. I think this again comes down to, like, for me, every aspect of my career, what always sort of comes front and center for me is collaboration. And the more we can collaborate, the better. And the thing that has really struck me, you know, coming up through sort of a doctoral program is just how, again, I started making these sort of broad statements, and again, you know, there's people doing it, but it's just how everyone in, so many people in academia are working in their own little bubbles, and just so much more amazing things can come from when we kind of, you know, work together. So I think someone made a comment earlier about like the sciences, but you know, you bring together the sciences and the humanities, or the pure sciences and the social sciences, and you put these people, you know, at tables together, and you're going to get magic. But we don't tend to do that a whole lot because we're kind of each in our silos or each in our own worlds. And I think when it does happen, it's incredible. And I mean, I would even sort of bring this forward into educating. So I mean, for sure, Henry can talk a lot about this in the IMHL, but you know, I've done quite a bit of teaching where I kind of do co-teaching. So I did it with a doctoral colleague of mine. Tamara and I have co-taught for many years in the School of Social Work. And I find when you bring like multiple perspectives into a classroom, that classroom just becomes so much more interesting. So, I mean, again, the colleague I did it with years ago, it was very interesting because we were both studying social work, but completely different thinkers. And I remember when we were putting together the syllabus, we were putting together this reading list, and she had put readings that she wanted to include that were the kind of readings that if professors put those on my reading list, I would be angry at them. Like I can't stand reading stuff if it's not written in normal English, or English that I can just understand without a dictionary or without a PhD. And she loved this stuff, very scholarly. And I remember looking at this going, I cannot sign my name to a syllabus that has this kind of reading, which I've hated most of my life. And then I was proposing stuff where she was kind of looking at it going, this is not academic enough. Like, how could we possibly, be including this in a reading list? And we didn't know each other well at that point, but we came together, we compromised, we put both on, and we both stood in the classroom together and taught this entire kind of course together. And it was incredible. It was incredible because we brought two very different perspectives of the same topic. That was number one. But I think almost more importantly, we really learned from each other. And she's now a professor. She's graduated and is a professor off in Calgary. And she wrote me a while back asking me for that reference, because the reference that she was saying, I don't think that's scholarly enough to add it to her syllabus in her class. So, I think the more we can collaborate and work together, the better. So coming back to the comment, if we can get the humanities and the sciences together, fantastic. Kind of like social work and management, I guess.
I don't see any additional questions here. Hold on a second. No. If people just want to unmute themselves and have any more comments, feel free.
There is a long comment from Michel Claire of Memorial University, or Michael Claire. I wonder if he's...
It's everyone's seen it. If you want, I could read it.
Sure.
Okay. My main worry about the future of academia is ideologues using the trappings of academia to advance their views. Plutocrats funding university centers or funding studies, for example. Some universities are happy to accept the money and turn a blind eye on the work of the centers and researchers. By the way, this is mostly an American phenomenon, but the erosion of academia is affecting universities everywhere, including in Canada.
Nothing new about that. I think Milton Friedman has done more harm to the world than probably almost anybody else with this economic nonsense that it's all about greed and it's all about markets and so on. It's, you know, as one view of human nature, it's fine. As the view of human nature, it's complete nonsense. You know, the economists have managed to get people to believe that there's a Nobel Prize in economics. They created that prize for themselves, and everybody calls it a Nobel Prize. It's a joke that they were able to do that. Ideologues are not new, and we're paying a huge price for all those kind of lopsided economists at the University of Chicago who have just thrown the world completely out of whack. So this isn't new. This has been going on forever.
I have a quick, coming back to Noel's comment, where you kind of talking about some of these things are, you know, with the community, like what's going on in certain universities. And I guess my sort of question to throw back is, you know, how can we tap into that? Like, I guess the idea, you know, the idea is you don't have to reinvent the wheel, right? If stuff is happening, how do we kind of bring it a bit more front and center and kind of learn from it and grow from it? So, I mean, you know, some of the things that I sort of come out in this discussion is that, you know, some of the comments or ideas that we're bringing up, the ideas that, you know, some of this is happening, it's out there. I guess my question back to the group, or if anyone wants to sort of dive into it, is how can we tap into these things that are happening, but are kind of not being made front and center, I guess, that could have so much more value if we were able to make more room for them.
Yeah.
I don't know if anyone has any comments or thoughts on it, but.
Well, I would just note that within most universities, I think there are ways of even the most solitary academic to connect with the university, with the community through resources that exist within the university. And what comes to mind, again, within my own experience, would be a department of marketing and communication, which is entirely devoted to putting the university in the public eye, and making an effort on the side of the academic to contact them and say, are there any resources or any opportunities to make known what I do? And that'd be one step for the individual. I think departments and faculties already are supposed to be doing that, and with more or less success.
I also wonder, I always like my kind of view of things, if you want to change the world, get to the students, because, you know, they're the ones who are going to then go forth and do things hopefully differently. And so you know, in response to what you're saying, I sort of wonder if, you know, we should be just part of the curriculum for doctoral studies is to be not just encouraging, but almost insisting that doctoral students, you know, at least once before they're done, you know, put something out there, you know, that's not academic, or at least make contact with, like you're saying, the Department of Marketing and Communications. Like maybe if we were to train future academics a little bit differently to be able to think about this and actually get some experience with it, maybe as they go forward in their careers, that could sort of help change things, you know, in their lifetime.
Walter Archer, you have a question?
Actually, I'd just like to pick up on that. McGill University, as pretty well every university, has a special unit charged with reaching out into the community. Yours is called the School of Continuing Studies, and they certainly have a lot of links with the city and sometimes beyond if they do distance education. They're not quite the same as the extension units, which preceded them, whose mission was to take the university throughout the province or the state or the world. But continuing studies, it's constrained by the need to break even at least, if not make money. But they still have a lot of links into the community.
So again, it could be sort of, connecting, kind of making, trying to make sure that we connect more people to that, to the School of Continuing Studies.
Several of the academic societies that I belong to, each year now, they have segments of their annual programs devoted to linking between academia and community. And I wonder if that's a common thing or simply a strange phenomenon in the societies I happen to belong to.
I think it varies a lot. When we went to UQAT, one of the things that struck us was how close a number of them were working with the Aboriginal community up there, communities up there, because they were surrounded by Aboriginal communities, and they seemed to be quite deeply involved with them. I think it varies a lot. It varies, as people were pointing out earlier, by department, because you've got departments like social work, like law, that are very connected. And you've got other departments, maybe like nuclear physics or God knows what, that may be less connected. They're connected with their own colleagues. Of course, they don't have to connect their ideas to develop things, but more in the social sciences, there's a need to connect. But there's also been a tradition in fields like psychology and sociology to get more and more removed from, often to get more and more removed from what's going on. I attended a conference on leadership in the States some years ago, and I couldn't, these are all respected academics, I couldn't believe the stuff they were talking about. It just seems so distant and obscure and irrelevant. And a couple of friends of mine who were senior managers in the National Film Board of Canada were interested in leadership. So I interpreted, I was the commentator at the conference, and I interpreted sort of how would these two react to these papers. And of course, there was a kind of pandemonium. How dare you use that standard? So then I had to go up and write my piece. So I actually gave the papers to these two people, two very intelligent practitioners, and they were scathing. I was tame. I mean, this stuff was just sheer junk. But nobody outside was evaluating it. So I proposed, they were named Bill and Barbara, and I proposed the Bill and Barbara test, that you publish nothing in Gold Star A journals that's not also reviewed by an intelligent practitioner. I'm talking about field, obviously not in physics, but I'm talking about fields like management or sociology or psychology, fields where lay people, intelligent lay people, can understand or should understand what these things are.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Susie, do you have any other comments or a final word?
I don't think so. I just, maybe one last thing, picking up on what Henry just said. I love the idea. I mean, if you could sort of, send your stuff off to some peer-reviewed journal, and one of those peers was someone in the field, I think two things would happen. One is you'd have someone looking at it with eyes who are kind of, on the ground. But I think also it would kind of encourage academics to have to write in a language that everyone can understand. I just can't. And I know in some specialties, like there's certain lingo that you have to use it, but when I read stuff that is just incomprehensible for someone who's intelligent, so I think if you had to sort of know that some practitioner was actually reading it, and maybe it would help us to sort of not accept the kind of language that sometimes is used in publication.
Yeah, it's a kind of smokescreen, it's evidence of a kind of smokescreen. And then when you read something, what I used to give my doctoral students, the first thing to read in the doctoral in my doctoral course was an article by Clifford Geertz, the famous anthropologist, called Notes on a Balinese Cockfight. And if you want to see a wonderful example of grounded, appealing, well-written evidence and research combined with incredibly sophisticated generalization, extrapolation, induction, it's a beautiful piece. So there's no reason why those two can't be combined. And the best of scholars just do it naturally.
Very good.
We have just real quick one more comment, and that we're going to close it at that. Ronald Krellinston again. He's saying that Professor Miriam Denov in McGill School of Social Work involves her research subjects in designing the research and uses community outreach to involve the wider community in the research. Some become her doctoral students, thereby creating a synergy between research, education, and community.
I will speak to Miriam Denov because she's one of my professors and one of my favorite professors. And I'll just tell you a story about Miriam. So in my first year, she taught a theory course to my cohort. We were 9 of us who did a theory course with her. And I mean, she just has this incredible way of teaching and connecting with students the same way she connects with her participants. And we were a very close-knit cohort, there were 9 of us. And when we finished that course, the kind of conversations and engagement we had was just so interesting that we didn't want to let it go. So we decided as a group that we wanted to continue these discussions and asked Miriam if she would be willing to just go on with us. And so we got together, I don't know, maybe a few weeks after we had finished the course, and casually got together, and someone brought muffins to the kind of gathering, and it ended up being called Muffins with Miriam. And Muffins with Miriam carried on for 6 years, like regularly, and now most students are graduated. But we had, like, during the pandemic, we had a Zoom Muffins with Miriam. So Miriam Denov has, what she does with her researchers, with her participants, she also has done with doctoral students. And what I love about the Muffins with Miriam is it really was about kind of this sense of community and collaboration, because it brought this group together, and really interesting stuff has come out of it. So Miriam does great stuff.
That's fantastic. So on that note, I will say thank you so much to both of you for this most engaging, nourishing intergenerational dialogue. And one would hope that management and social work and humanities and the sciences will get together in the future so that we have a very much more progressive society. I'd like to thank all of you, the participants, for your insightful comments that enriched that dialogue. Thank you as well to Kate McGuire for organizing this event. Thank you to all of our Canadian colleagues for your participation, and to our Mura members for your continuing support. So please keep safe and well. Au revoir. À la prochaine.
À la prochaine.
Right.